Hey everyone, Hugo here. I am super excited to introduce you all to Ravin Kumar. Ravin, thanks for coming and speaking to this wonderful group of humans I'm working with at the moment.
Yeah, you're always working with wonderful groups of humans, Hugo. I knew that going in.
It doesn't always feel that way, geez. No, but teaching this course in particular is cool. I do get to work with a lot of cool people such as yourself. A bit about Ravin. Ravin works at Google DeepMind and he works on so many cool things, including the Gemma family of models. And we've actually run a series of several workshops on building locally using Gemma models and done a bunch of podcasts on them. And I'll link to those afterwards for those interested. But it's always great to chat with Ravin about what he's up to and then teach all the stuff he's building as well. Prior to that, Ravin was working on NotebookLM and Mariner, which we may hear about today. Before that, Ravin, you're at SpaceX.
What was it, SpaceX? Yeah, fun company.
Rocket science, dude. But before that, or was it before or after, you're at Sweetgreen as well.
Three green after SpaceX. Yeah.
I don't know if this is like getting salads to working America. But without further ado, Ravin, do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, let me go ahead and cue this up. As I understand, you're all in Hugo's class, and Hugo's class is largely focused on building products with models. It's about how you can take these LLMs and build something that brings users joy, or your users. So I'm going to talk about building AI apps and building cars and how these two technologies are similar, even though they're 100 years apart, but the subtleties about AI apps and the timescales that make it so different. Going back a little bit farther in my career, as Hugo had mentioned, I used to work on cars as a mechanical engineer. And that's where I started. That's how I got into SpaceX. But I've now shifted through a long series of job hops into building LLMs and products at Google. The two last products that I built that were full production products were Project Mariner, which is our agentic browser. It's the agentic layer that's in Chrome, and then NotebookLM, which is like a knowledge build your own RAG type of nice UI interface. And now I build Gemma models. Gemma models are still products, but a little bit more of a developer product where you take Gemma and put it into something else. So went a little lower in the stack. What I want to talk about though is how we can learn a lot from cars. At one point, cars were an innovative technology. It feels a little strange to think about that now when they're an everyday occurrence, but they were a game changer. It took a long time for us to get from nothing to cars, but they started around 1769. You have this car with a steam boiler in front, weird architecture for a car. We then got to a sort of modernish car another 100 years later. But the point I'm trying to make is that cars didn't just come out and become like the thing that we all use today. It took a while for us to figure out how to take an engine, and you consider an LM to be an engine, and put it together with all the other stuff like a seat and a steering wheel and the stuff that makes it nice to use a car in a certain configuration. LLMs are doing this. LLMs are the engine, and all this now is happening much faster than ever before. So we're, I think, 2 years after ChatGPT, about 7 years since we had even the Transformer paper, which was barely even an engine, and now we have LLMs all over the place. Maybe probably even more LLMs than cars at this point. And so I just want to give you the advice straight up front, and we'll talk through it one by one, because it is really easy to take that engine that is an LLM and just put it together in all sorts of different ways and be excited about it, but miss the nuance that it takes to make a great app. So the 5 points I have is think about who the user is and the use case. This matters more than anything else. Don't start with the model. This is where I see many people fail with AI product development. Think about your eval plan. Think about the lifestyle and maintenance of this thing as it goes through a number of years. And then I'll talk through some case studies at Google Apps on the products that I built. So the first question to ask is who's the user and what's the user use case? And so if we go back to cars, since way back in 1769 with that original steam boiler engine, we now have a lot of different cars. We have the ones that if you're in the US or most Australia or most industrialized countries, you'll see, a sedan like this Toyota, I think it's actually a Honda, this Honda at the bottom. But there's specialized variants too. You have the small taxi cab, two-person, three-person taxi cab, and you have a semi-truck. And really, what happened, as we can all guess, is that people realized that some companies need massive things that can move lots and lots of cargo, and so they bulked up and they had this massive semi-truck. And some smaller organizations or countries realized that these smaller cabs were suitable for their smaller streets and quick transportation. And you just have two very different styles of users. You can imagine how ridiculous it would be if you took your semi truck to the local grocery store. way too big of a vehicle to pick up 1 gallon of milk or 1 liter of milk, let's say. But you can also imagine how ridiculous it'd be if you needed to move 500 gallons of milk or 500 liters or 2,000 liters of milk, and you showed up with the little taxi on the right. There's different users and there's different use cases, and it's the same thing with the apps. What I often see is people have they need to do something very simple. They need to take maybe just the text on this page and they need to summarize it, and they pull out the biggest model. They grab like a GPT-5 or a Gemini 2.5 Pro or Claude, the biggest Claude model, and it's gonna work. Like you're gonna get your small liter of milk home, but you're gonna be using insane resources to do so. But whereas you could do the same thing with a smaller model. And so when people start with the model, which is why I'm saying you should start with your user, not with the model, when people start with the model, they tend to grab the biggest model for a lot of reasons, which we'll talk about, and I'm sure will come from the questions. So my advice, don't start with the model, start with the user. Think about your users, technical needs, what reliability is needed, who pays the cost of the application, you or the client you're working with, and focus more on what you're building, not so much the model itself. So this is an exercise I have for you folks to try it with your own products. If you had to explain your product without saying AI, would it still sound like a good idea? And we can talk later about the products that I have later. The reason that I'm saying that is oftentimes too, a lot of products come out, and the first thing that is said is like, this is using the best model, this is the using an AI powered application. And again, the focus comes onto the AI and the model, and very little on what the user is or what they need. You want to ensure that your product makes sense without you ever saying AI, without you ever saying frontier model, and then you can back into what kind of model you need for it. I will put on, I cannot see the Discord or your faces anymore, so I will take questions at the end when I go through the presentation, but let's queue them up. And Hugo always is a wonderful MC, so we'll get to them all. So going back to that point, let's not obsess over the model. The thing that happens, like I said, when people obsess over the model is they grab the biggest one and they tend to put it in their product. And if we took a biggest engine that ever existed and we put it into a passenger car, it wouldn't fit and it would be crazy and it would be ridiculous. But unfortunately, with AI apps, it's a little bit easier to do this. It's much easier to grab the biggest model and just plug it in when you could have used a much more reasonable size. So talking about the model picking strategy, like I said, figure out the user case and application flow. The next thing to do, though, which is factual, is you do want to pick a model that's going to work with your use case. If we take the car analogy again, if you pick an engine that's too small, your Honda is not going to go. It's going to get stuck if you pick like a small two-stroke engine. So you do need to right size a little bit, but that doesn't mean pick the biggest one. The way you right size is building an eval pipeline, which we're going to talk about evals a whole bunch. And then what you can do with that pipeline is test different models while checking your evals. And so the next thing, as we go back into this or move into this, is evaluating your user happiness. With cars, there's a lot of different ways to measure what cars can do. There's horsepower. You can say a car has 600 horsepower. You could pick another metric like steering angle. How fast can it turn? You could look at buyer reviews. What are people saying about it on automotive magazines? You could do miles per gallon or miles per liter or kilometers per liter. There's so many benchmarks. But the important thing is some benchmarks only matter in certain cases. If you're going to be building a race car, you probably care a lot about horsepower and how much power this thing can put out. But there's this opposite metric called torque pounds. That's what you have when you have a semi truck. You don't care how much power can be put down instantaneously. You care more about how it can pull a big load. If you're building a car for a passenger, you're really going to care that the air conditioning is nice. But if it's a race car driver, like an F1 car, there's not even an air conditioning to deal with. And so there's the same thing on the LLM side. There are so many different ways to understand what a model is. There's number of parameters, there's tokens per second, there's languages, there's latency, there's cost per token. If you're just trying to understand your model based off some benchmarks that the model publishers have published, which I am a model publisher, so I do publish metrics, you're not going to be able just to figure out what model you need just by looking at some random smattering of metrics. What I suggest you do rather is if we focus back on the user, you focus on what is it that makes the user happy. And there's a couple ways you can get a sense of this. The biggest one is just, are people coming to your app or are they referring other people? It doesn't tell you a lot about the LLM, but it tells you a lot about the application itself. Of course, though, because we are building AI powered applications, we do need to understand how the model fits in with the whole thing. So there are some I'm calling micro evals, or I should have called them model level evals, and I should have called the left maybe product level evals of just what is your model outputting? Is it good? Is it bad? Rating the outputs just by themselves, independent of the rest of the UI. Is the model robust to inputs? As the users put in weird things, are they still getting good outputs? And maybe if you have like a real-time application, like what is the latency? How quickly is your model getting you answers? So here's my suggestion of how to eval. The easiest thing to do is if you have an idea for your users, you don't need to build anything in an application. You can go to an AI studio type of thing or Olama, and you just try a couple prompts yourself. You just check to see whether your cool idea is going to work. The reason I say this is there's things that actually, when I gave this presentation last year, weren't possible, and now they are possible. A good example is a really good a coding bot. 2 years ago, models were not able to do multi-step coding workflows. So if your idea was to come up with a bot that would help you provide pull requests or code reviews, it would maybe be doing an okay job. It definitely wouldn't be able to code. These days, when I just kick the tires of coding evals on all the models, the big ones do really great. This is an example of just going in and trying things out. The next step, though, is you want to get out of this sort of vibe eval space pretty quick. You want to build an eval set of all your ideas for what you think customers will want. You may not have customers or users yet, but you can start at least capturing the essence of what you think it is they're going to do. The reason is you want to also run this regularly across many models, and you don't want to be writing it by hand each time. So you iterate on 1 and 2 until you're pretty confident you're going to get something you like. Now you're going to spend a lot of time between step 2 and step 3 building the product, building the UI, deploying it, doing all sorts of, let's say, application 2.0 type of things. But once you launch, you have another opportunity to eval. What the eval happening here, though, is different. You're not the one constructing the eval set. Your users are essentially evaling your application by just being users. And so you're going to want to look at what they're doing, look at their data, and adjust the product based on what you're seeing. And what you're going to want to do then is you're going to want to take those online evals and you're going to take them and turn them, a couple of them, into offline evals to update your eval set and to keep on iterating. So this is the next part, is that there's a big difference in timescale between a demo and a full-blown application. It's cool to drive a car around a test lot when you're evaluating a car to purchase, but you're probably not going to see a check engine light. This car is brand new. It hasn't had a lot of issues. The dealer probably made sure it was tuned up correctly. So you won't see a check engine light. But once you buy a car, this will eventually come on. The car will eventually degrade, things will change, you're going to hit some speed bumps, some potholes. The same thing is going to happen to your app. So you really need to think a lot about how long your product is going to last. What is the duration of the experience? What happens when new models come out? Will your product adapt? Will you stay with the old ones? A big one is, are there any critical dependencies for your project? These are both dependencies that are like the standard software dependencies, but also even the AI parts. What happens if the model shifts? I mean, so if you built your model, if you built your application on GPT 3.5 or an older version of Gemini, those models go away after a while. Is your application robust to the newest models or changes? You're going to want to assess that. And the last one is actually one of the hardest ones, especially in the AI space. Things are moving so fast that an AI experience that users were happy with in January is no longer one they're happy with in November. This is happening for two reasons. One is models are getting really good and users are expecting more and more to be automated for them because they see other folks building things with more powerful models. But also people just forget how bad early LMs are, I have to say. The early versions of Gemini, honestly, were not as great as the ones now, but people don't look at that and go, oh, it's Gemini 1.0. We don't care. They're more like, oh, Gemini 2.5 is doing amazing. Why isn't this thing kept up? So you're going to want to think really hard about way past the demo lifecycle. Everything's going to look good in a demo, but think about 6 months from now if things are still going to work and if your whole experience is going to be cutting edge in a rapidly moving world. And so I'm going to talk quickly about some of my failures to illustrate where I got these things wrong, and then we'll go into questions. So one is focusing on micro evals too early. I focused a lot on like LM benchmarks and MMLU score and stuff like that. And I really should have thought more about how is this going to fit in with the user experience. Part of that was talking to stakeholders that weren't just the ones hyped about AI. I think being in Google, I am in a little bit of a bubble that the whole company is AI centric. And so when you talk to users, they all know about AI. But when you take a product and I say, take it to my mom or take it to folks that are not in an AI organization, they're not as hyped about AI as I am sometimes, and which is fine. But then they have a very different experience. So I should have talked to folks like that too. And then thinking very short term. With the speed things are going, it's very easy to get hyped about building quick demos, putting them out there. But thinking about the stability and longevity was important to me because I've deployed some products that look cool and had some cool feature engineering and stuff like that. But within 6 months, it was better just to let the model do the work and not rely on my hack together like text processing code. And so this is the same advice again at the beginning, but I'm going to say it again with context. You should really focus on the user and their use case and build a product around that. The model is much less important than you think. I think this is also in real life where I think more folks are realizing they don't need to think so much about the model, but there is still this hype when models come out that people should grab the latest model and just shove it into their product. You do need to update models, but the way to do that is not just from whatever is on Hacker News or whatever the latest model is, but it's through evals. You want to check when you're using models that the evals that look good now look good on your new model as well, and hopefully look better in your new model. But if they look worse, you know not to upgrade. Thinking hard about how long you want to maintain your AI app. This is both just good business practice at this point because something that may be smart now, maybe not so great a year from now as the model capabilities improve, but also thinking past just making a flashy demo, but how you're going to build some long-term recurring value for your users. And then the last one is think about folks that have built or are building products. It helps to have their advice to keep yourself grounded. And so that's all I have for my canned slides. I'm going to go ahead and just stop the screen share. I think I heard a couple questions coming over Discord.
Yeah, there's something you mentioned just about the how much better models are getting and how that changes how we approach specific things. Like 6 months ago, tool calling was a lot worse. Just in terms of models calling the right tools. And what I've seen as a result of that is people have just like people rip out stuff more and more than they do with traditional software. So I gave the example of Manus. So Manus is an AI agent, Chinese company based out of Singapore now. They build a lot of really interesting stuff. I need to fact check myself, but I think they've ripped out most of their infrastructure and rebuilt their system 5 times in the past 12 months or something like that. Not necessarily their evaluations and that type of stuff, but how things are actually working just because of how much better models are getting. So I'm wondering if that's something you've seen as well.
That is true. I think in within the Google products, for instance, tool calling is a good example. We used to have a lot more checks and things like that when even Gemini was not as good at tool calling. But as the models got better, we could rip out a lot of this scaffolding, things like that. Another example, just which is a combination of model and product, is we just released a file API just the earlier this week. And so a lot of people that may have built really custom RAG solutions, which were needed when this API didn't existed, could now migrate to this API if they wanted to. So it's such a fast moving space that like when you think about cars, if I go back to the car analogy, for instance, the earliest cars used to have headlamps that you would have to light as a candle yourself, right? Like that was the architecture, that was the way you did things. It took I think 10 or 20 years before you had electric light bulbs and things like that were fully integrated. That's a 20-year lifespan just for one tiny feature of a car. Now it would be crazy to think you have to do this with a car. So you're just seeing that just all over the AI space. Things that were necessary, having a box of matches in your car to light your headlights with literal candles is not a thing that exists anymore.
Yeah.
Um,
The other thing, I've been thinking about this thing that I call the two cultures of AI agents. And one is where we build from the bottom up, augment LLMs, start building workflows. And that's something we'll cover later in this course, like mindfully add tool calls. And that's when you want to build robust, reliable software for end users. Once again, a booking.com travel assistant doesn't want to have 30% failure rates in tool calls. Whereas with Manus or with Cursor or these types of tools, when you have a savvy human in the loop with high supervision, you can have high agency that makes mistakes as well. So I think there is a culture, particularly in software, for end users like us who are software builders of building agentic systems that do all this wild stuff because we're so in the loop with them. But for people working in health or finance in highly regulated spaces, serving products to external users, you actually don't want to just YOLO it and switch out models and get user feedback immediately, right?
I think so. I mean, I agree with you that this is like the evals portion of things that I have you covered this already in your course? Or are you about to?
We just had a 2 hour workshop on evals. This couldn't have been more perfectly timed,
Okay,
man.
perfect. So I think I didn't know you guys were doing evals today, so I promise I didn't come
I
in
didn't know
hot.
you were going to talk about evals either. So this was sometimes the stars align.
That is the case here. So evals are really the answer to all these, and it's your own custom eval, not just an eval that somebody else built. It really takes that, I think, in this modern day, both to track where things are going, but also check that you're getting what you need out of these models, which is different than what model publishers are often publishing as part of their metrics.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned, and Brad has a question we'll get to in a second, but I love that you mentioned it's really evals that correspond to your particular what you're working on. And also, this is something we went through in the workshop, the failure modes. And Wilma, who's got a great question we'll get to in a second, she asked in the workshop, are there resources on the types of evals you should be writing, that type of stuff? And I said, my response was yes, and the types of failures you should be looking for. And I was like, yes, there are resources on that, but I almost hesitate to share them, and I will share them. But the reason I hesitate is because you really learn by looking at what's happening in your system and see what you need to fix, right?
Yeah, I think it's really the end of it is nobody else knows your whole user flow and system as well as you do. It's a really great data source and place for insights is just paying attention to what your users are doing, seeing how your own system is operating, and then integrating that really well with the model that you're using.
Totally. Hey, Brad.
Hey, Ravin, thanks for the talk. I always love your talks so much, and they really help me think about things in a better way. I really like the car analogy. I really wanted to ask you this question for a while, actually. You're perfect for this because you kind of work in the lab, but you also build products. I saw a post this morning, which is related to it, which was that foundational AI companies are basically going to crush the incumbent wrappers or startup products. And I just wonder how you think about this, like in terms of, I know that this is the model progress question again, but the post was basically saying there's like a 12 to 24-month window for startups, unless they're extremely niche, to be able to produce something that won't get abstracted away by these larger models. How do you think about that? I know, like, I understand your examples with the evals and thinking about the customer first. Completely agree with that. But do you think about what is going to be abstracted away? And why don't you build a product yourself? Like, why are you working with Google?
Two excellent questions. I'll go with the last one first. The reason I work at Google and I've since moved to DeepMind is I like building models a lot, and Google is one of the few places where you can build a frontier model. I think there's only probably 5 organizations in the world where you're actively part of the frontier model building process, and so I like that, and that's something I want to participate in, which is why I'm now in DeepMind. And but I will point out that's different than a product because it's a blend of research and things like that. So that's what keeps me at Google versus moving to a product type of company. Now, your second part of your questions is how do you build a product that's defensible or doesn't totally get overrun? What I would say is the other way I would put it actually is that if your product is parsing PDFs and putting them straight into ChatGPT, and it's in the nicest way, it's not a super defensible product anyway. It's kind of like if I was in the US, if I was to open a taco stand, it's a very crowded space, if that makes sense. And this is not to say tacos aren't innovative or the people that make tacos aren't innovative, but it's like you're taking an idea that isn't a super novel idea, and so of course a lot of people are going to have it, and of course if it becomes popular enough, then yeah, you'll move it. The analogy that I like using is that grocery stores, for instance, in the U.S. have especially Mexican ones have taco stands, so you're like competing with the supplier for the stuff that you're buying, right? You can do it, and you can maybe have the best PDF parser ever, but I would assume Google or other companies are going to move in. So one is it's the same thing even before LLMs. You probably want a product that is more has more of a moat, as they like saying in business language, and is more unique or more niche, or just so innovative that it wouldn't just be copied by a large organization. And you do see a number of organizations in the startup space that are like this. One that is currently top of mind, I have no affiliation with them, but is one called Periodic Labs. The reason I bring it up is similarly the question you asked me earlier. The co-founders are this one guy named Liam Fettis and another guy named Alexander Passos. They were both at OpenAI. They helped build GPT. So again, like superstars of the field, my colleague, analogous colleagues in other areas, and they decided they want to work on a company that does LMs for physical material. And so they're doing a lot of innovation and they have a lot of big plans. But of course, the big bet they're making is they're not going to get run over by the same company they just left. But they didn't just come out and make a Chat GPT wrapper, for instance. That makes sense. Liam didn't just quit. And I don't know Liam personally, so I'm not speaking for him, but he didn't leave OpenAI and make a PDF wrapper. So I think to your point, and maybe to my point, is you really want to think a lot about your users and your product, and you frankly want to have a lot of business sense of whether a lot of folks, if you have a differentiated way of serving your users, because if you don't, you're probably going to be a very competitive marketplace, and that's something you're just going to have to work with.
Do you have a couple more minutes for Wilma to ask a
Yeah,
question?
yeah. Sure.
Wilma has a really wonderful question around criteria with respect to when a Gen AI product is ready for production. So maybe you could ask your question, Wilma.
Yeah, hi, Ravin. Yeah, just have a quick question because I'm just curious, how would your team or you determine like when your Gen AI product is ready for production? There are so many considerations behind. It could be performance, latency, user experience, all those considerations, right?
I think the best one for me is like when you sense the first couple users, like your first couple beta testers are just seeing this like moment of joy and they're like really happy with it. it's really hard to quantify, and it's tough because as a data scientist / LM person, you really want to have some numerical measure. But this word gets thrown a lot in the AI space, as I'm sure you've heard. But it's like the vibes that somebody takes your product and they're just vibing with it well. Like it just works for them. They're getting it. They at least see the promise, even if it's not polished. That's usually a good time to go for it. And I say that for two reasons. I think this era of like if I think I'm old enough now where I may date myself, but like you would polish Windows 95, and I've never worked at Microsoft, and I was like 3 years old at the time or something. But like you've polished Windows 95 to perfection, and you ship it, and you hope users will like it. Like that era of software development is bygone over. So what you instead do is you ship your product, and honestly, usually a beta or an alpha state, and you see whether users are happy with it, and that moves the bar up very, very close. One is you can ship earlier than you probably think. The second is you kind of want to see how users are working with your application. So my advice for you. Oh, and I would also say with AI, this is all supercharged because previously I think I was old enough at this point was like the App Store and stuff like that. You could spend like a month or two building an app and then deploy it to the App Store. But these days things are just moving it so quickly. I would suggest build your own eval set internally and make sure you like how it works. Just go show it to a couple of your friends or people maybe a little bit outside of the periphery to get a sense of whether they like it, and then just ship it and start collecting data. The other reason this is great is that when you start collecting data, you can improve your product faster, and the rest of the process just flows much more smoothly.
Thanks so much, Ravin. Thank you for the great questions.
Thanks, great suggestions. Yeah.
Of course.
Thank you all for the wonderful questions. We're at time, but thank you all for joining, particularly after a 2-hour workshop. And thank you, Ravin, for just sharing all of your insights from what you've been up to. And yeah, wonderful work as always, man.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And it was very nice seeing you all. Best of luck building your AI products. There's no better time to go build stuff.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everyone. See ya.